Stanford is women, right? So we are represented well. 208 of the 696 engineering undergraduate majors at Stanford are women. So while that's a lower figure, it is still higher than it has been. 52% of life science doctorates given every year in the United States are to women, and 40% of those doctorates in STEM fields overall are women. So we're making progress. However, 19% of full professors in the STEM fields are women. 19%. 52% of women in the STEM fields drop out of the private sector science jobs within 1 to 2 years. So that is significant. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We could discuss that in depth quite a lot. Of course, men are not representing in certain fields either. Right? So we can, as we see, sexism affects everybody, not just women.
Traditionally, we've conceptualized gender as binary, so as in there's two genders, male and female, and that a person who's transgender would be seen as somebody who's a man born into a woman's body or vice versa. And that idea has evolved over time, first into the idea of gender more as a spectrum with masculinity at one end and femininity at the other end, androgyny in the middle, which allows some room for people to fall somewhere along that spectrum and perhaps make room for a sensitive, artistic male or really assertive, athletic female along those lines. The most recent conceptualization treats gender less as a linear spectrum and more as a web or a snowflake, in recognition that gender is a construct with a lot of different components.
The New York Times, did anybody catch the recent New York Times article about makeup? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of interesting, and I note that I'm not wearing the glamour look today. Right? I never do, except when I want to look older, right? Which is something I felt that the piece left out. But it does show that makeup increases people's perception of competence in women. Salary inequality. This is a stat that is often quoted. That while we are 49.9% of the workforce, we make 77 cents to the male dollar. 77 cents. Now, when a few years ago, about 10 years ago, it was 50 cents. So not only are we progressing, we're progressing rather rapidly. But here's something interesting. The numbers are almost equal to the salaries of men if we don't have children.
A lot of the women here, because we are women and we are here, we don't think that there is sexism or that we don't necessarily see the sexism in our lives. Especially undergraduates, because we kind of come from this generation where there hasn't been as much discrimination. We didn't know housewives of the 60s. We were never part of that. And so one of the things I think is most important is just recognizing what sexism, what discrimination, what lack of communication, what that looks like for us. That looks like ending our sentences with question marks. When women do that, it means I'm looking for approval, but we don't realize that we're doing that. And nobody's telling us that. And we don't think that there's anything wrong with that.
Working at the Women's Community Center has really given me a great opportunity to work firsthand with students about some of the concerns and issues that they face. And as Sarah mentioned so eloquently and so relevantly, it is a lot more difficult to identify overt sexism for undergraduates because women are, there's parity in terms of the numbers for undergraduates. At the graduate level, on the other hand, there is a big disparity in terms of numbers. Graduate women only comprise 37% of the entire population. So the graduate women that we work with on campus, definitely come to the center with specific needs, challenges, and concerns. And so it's interesting to be able to see two populations on the same campus, undergraduate and graduate, who have different experiences with sexism and with inequalities based on gender or gender stereotypes. And so I think the point about taking a step back and assessing what the situation is really important.
I think it's really important to be keeping gender variance in dialogues both around LGBT community and dialogues around gender as a whole.
In my work, I think think that there's two kind of levels that I approach it with students. The first is the personal approach, and the personal level of understanding where that person comes from, the multiple identities that our students face. Everybody, whether you're white, whether you're a person of color, whether you're whatever gender you identify with, everybody has multiple identities. And so at the personal level, really helping people understand that about themselves and about each other, and stretching each other to get to that new level of understanding. And then just personally understanding obstacles, personal styles and things like that. The second level and the second piece of it is structural inequalities. And so taking a look at how our structural, not just as the institution of Stanford, but as organizations, as departments, as societal groups, how do the structural inequalities affect people, and how can we change those? And the biggest way to change that is to get more diversity at the table of decision making, whether it's in education, in media, and in politics.
I cannot change people's socialization, right? But what I can do is I can be very much aware of it, and I can talk about it, so that we are talking about it, so that I am telling you, and you're telling me, and we're working together in this process. So to me, it starts with awareness personally, and I think I try very hard not to answer with a question mark. I just did. But this it's funny when it's on your mind, you do what you don't want to do. Same with communications, right? But to me, a lot of it is awareness. For example, if I'm going to a meeting with some people at an executive level, a male especially, I'm not going to wear pink. I don't wear my hair down. I do not wear skirts. And it's not that I want to look like a male, and that is a mistake that a lot of people make. They often will, first of all, conflate aggression with assertiveness. Instead of being passive, I'm not going to be passive, so instead I'm going to tell you exactly what I think, and that doesn't work either, by the way. The assumption is that that does work with men, and that is why men have made it as far as they have, but that's not necessarily true. It's because men have not been afraid to ask for what they want. And, of course, sexism along the lines historically has helped them. But at this point, a lot of it is communication and how communication is done. And assertiveness is not the same as aggression. But to me, I don't dress a certain way when I'm going to be with certain people because I want to take gender out of it as much as possible. I don't want that to be a part of it. I don't want to be perceived in a certain way. I'm not suggesting that that's what you should do. What I am suggesting is that you be aware of it. And you are aware of your image.
But I think you bring up a really good point about always having the burden and the onus of educating other people if you're the one who's aware and knowledgeable or living in that space where that unconscious bias is unfortunately inflicted upon. And it's about picking your battles, deciding when is the right time to speak up. If it's something in a moment where you feel safe and you feel comfortable and you think that it's important for that person or the people around you to say something, you can, but it can get tiring and it can get old and it can be really depressing to do that constantly. So you have to protect yourself, and you have to, save your energy for when you think it's really important. I had a student a few years ago who was in engineering, and she was in a student group, and it was pretty much all men and just she. And so she mentioned to me that she noticed that anytime she said something, an idea, they would just gloss over her. And this is like 2 years ago. I'm not talking about back in the 60s or back in the 70s. Like this was 2 years ago at Stanford. And then she noticed they would give her the notepad to take notes, during the meetings. And then she noticed that if a guy said the same exact thing that she did, everyone's, oh my God, that's a great idea. This is her lived experience, And so she asked, what should I do? She was just going to quit and just leave the group. And I asked her, okay, what's important to you? Do you feel like there's value in this organization? Do you feel like there's something that you want to continue with? And she did. She felt like she did still want to stay in the group because she liked the content. So then we brainstormed, well, how can you approach it? Because if this is something that's important to you, you have to learn, how this, unfortunately, this is a case where you are going to have to say something. So she brought it up to the guys and said, that we kind of worked on the wording, but she said, I know you're not meaning to be sexist, but these are the things that I'm noticing. And she just laid it out for them. Like, when I say something, so-and-so said the exact same thing. And they actually thanked her for bringing it up, because she wasn't saying, you guys are sexist for all of these reasons. She was saying, I know this is unintentional, but this is how it's impacting me. And I think that was a really pivotal point for her in moving forward, to be able to decide what's important and how best to approach it, as opposed to attacking people for not knowing.
Self-education. So this summer I actually worked for Edgar as a fellow, with Edgar basically. I was a fellow for Stanford College Prep, and we had a summer program, and I taught a course on language and social change. And just thinking about how something as simple as language affects sexism. I know we all know, like, oh, why is he or his the default pronoun? We've had a lot of conversations on that. But also, there's many, many, many other ways to erase people from language. And I think just thinking about that is really helpful. So I think taking language from where you start. So instead of saying, of course, I'm blanking on a really good example. Anyway, I'll probably come up with one while they're speaking. But just thinking about what you do and how you speak, instead of saying, you know, women, so we say women CEOs, right? And we want to say that because we think it's important to talk about those 18 women, right? But they're CEOs first. We think it's important to talk about lawyers, women lawyers, because there didn't used to be very many. Now, but they're lawyers first, or they're not women chefs, right? They're chefs first. So when we say that, you know, it's one thing to say, you know, start, instead of saying a woman lawyer, say, oh, you know, I'm really inspired by this lawyer, she, instead of specifying women lawyers, because that differentiates them from lawyers. They need a description. I think that's a really good place to start, and just think about how many times you say that, or you read that, or someone else says that, and what you can do.
One of the most difficult things about being the quote-unquote other, whether that is, it pertains to gender or race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, is you never know what's happening, right? So if somebody doesn't like me, or they don't respond well, or they hand me the notepad, I don't know if it's because I have said something incorrectly or said something offensive, or if it's perhaps that I'm a woman, right? Or that I'm a person of color, or that I'm lesbian, gay, bisexual. I don't always know, because it could be that I'm a woman. But I think what is significant about the story that Faith tells is that you cannot approach it with the assumption that, right? This is what is significant about communication, is questioning.
Building a community of allies, so that you don't always have to be the one to say the thing. There's a couple groups that we have in my department that specifically work around diversity issues, and one of the things that I've tried to do in building those groups is invite people who are different from me, and maybe who need to be brought up to date a little bit in their attitude, so they can have the exposure from the other people there. And one of the things that I've seen happen is that as people get exposed to the new ideas, then they take that piece on, and I don't have to anymore. And so, you know, the medical director is now going to Vaden's director and saying, you know, we need more resources around transgender students, you know, and she's insisting on it, which is great, so that it doesn't have to be my voice. And then also in the room where sometimes one of the males in the room will be pointing out when a comment was maybe offensive to women, and I might be pointing out when a comment was offensive to people of color. And I think that it's good to feel held in that way, and also it's just nice to not always be holding the thing in that way.
The first one that comes to mind is bringing cookies to the office. I think being intentional is really important, but I also think, I know on this campus, you know, I interact with a lot of student leaders, a lot of people who are interested in social justice. And this summer I learned how to cook. And I love to cook, and I love to bake, and I clean, and it doesn't really bother me. But I inherently feel bad, because it's like, well, you know, I'm supposed to go out and be this strong woman, therefore I shouldn't want to, you know, stay home and cook dinner, because that's what I want to do, or bake cookies for my friends. So you also have to come from this point of view where don't be afraid to do what you want and be who you are. You know, be intentional about it in the spaces where you need to be intentional. But when you go home, like, it's really important not to hate yourself for baking cookies. I think that's really important, and that's something that's weighed very heavily on me. You know, especially learning to cook this summer, and oh, I want to bake cookies for my dorm and do all these things that are mothering and that people might look down on me for, but that's also who I am, and I shouldn't have to be ashamed of that, as long as I understand how I'm going to function in society.
Mentoring, both in your field and outside of your field, male and female, is very important. But what is most important is knowing what you want out of that relationship, knowing what you are lacking, not necessarily being a woman or male, but also just in general, what do you need to know and what conversations do you need to have.
And yourself first, and reflecting inward in terms of your awareness of the issues, understanding what it means to be an advocate for women's issues, and that it doesn't necessarily, a lot of times people make the assumption, both men and women, that it takes something away from men if you only focus on women, and so it's important not only to educate yourself about the issues and the truth, but also engage with other people about what that really means. And in terms of being yourself, that was actually, I definitely think that that's really important. One word that we haven't mentioned today is feminism and the feminist movement, and I think it's really important that people who identify as feminists, I do, by the way, claim that publicly, and it's going to look different. Every feminist does not look the same. Every feminist does not have exactly the same beliefs, but that's what feminism is about to me. It's about the freedom of choice, to be who you are, to have political, social, and economic equality, but also to have the choice and freedom within all of those realms to just be who you are. And so I do think it is really important to understand the systems, understand what works in different systems to be able to get your point across if you need to project in a certain way. But most importantly, I think it's really important for us to be true to who we are as individuals and have honest, authentic conversations with each other. And if there's some painful things coming up or going on that you are seeing or encountering, find the courage to either address it in that moment or find someone or like-minded people who you feel like you can have conversations with. So the point about mentoring and networking I think is really important. Ann Firth Murray, who's on campus as well, mentioned about mentors that you should think about your mentors as creating your own board of directors. So everyone doesn't just have to have one mentor. You can think of mentors for different strengths or different things you like in your life. And there's definitely a few people that I feel have both peer mentors as well as mentors who have gone before me, and also I look up to some students who have really taught me a lot, so I don't think it necessarily has to be hierarchical. So I just encourage everyone to think differently about different things and reach out for the help that you need.
Here in particular, many of us are really well-meaning and open-minded, but we can find our anxiety peaking in the presence of somebody who's trans or gender variant, and start wondering, what pronoun should I use? Should I interact with this person more like a male or more like a female? What if I slip up and use their old name? Should I mention how much I enjoyed Chaz on Dancing with the Stars? How do I connect, And I think that just kind of not knowing the right thing to say in itself can be really challenging, especially on this campus, more than necessarily a lack of tolerance and outright and closed-mindedness. So one of the things that I've tried to do around that is organize some trainings on campus. So some of the things that have happened lately is the spring retreat in our department was a training on cultural competence with transgender folks. And we did a transgender mental health and wellness here in August, and we're working on creating a section on our website that has transgender information and resources. And we're working with Larry and Zappert so that the sexual harassment trainings in the future will have a gender identity component, because that can be considered part of sexual harassment too. And each time I organize a training for others or take part in a training for others, I end up learning a lot myself, so it really adds to my own professional development. I didn't know all these stuff before I started kind of feeling like these trainings need to happen. And then the people I meet in the context of having them come and do trainings end up being helpful resources and mentors for me.